You need to understand that they are asking you to discuss whether cars should be produced by the private or the public. They're giving you two options, either private or public. So obviously there is a big problem that so a lot of students will end up saying that you know what, the car should be produced in the public sector because it will provide cheaper quality car which will help the poor and so forth. Now this is just one side of the argument that they're giving. Now they're not recognizing the fact that if you let public sector produce the cars, then what about the rich people who have the money to buy luxury cars? Where will they get those luxury cars then? They obviously have to import. And if they import luxury cars, they end up paying huge duties on it. And that makes them feel quite unhappy. So their welfare is harmed. In that sense, yes, number one. Number two, if you're importing more luxury cars, what will happen? Your import cost would rise and the country's balance of payment would definitely be affected negatively. So again, you see, one problem, one thing that is very beneficial seems one thing that appears to be beneficial seems harmful in other ways as well. And this is how you evaluate in the exam, by saying, although yes, public sector production would definitely help in terms of cheaper cars, but then the fact that it would result into a rise in import costs is also something that the government should keep into consideration before making a decision whether they should go for allowing only private sector production or public sector production take place, right? Um, so this is a level 3 answer. Now let's just go through the अच्छा हाँ. So level 2 answer क्या होता है? Level 2 answer होता है recent discussion which makes use of economic information. The answer may lack some depth and development. So you'll get 3 and 5 marks if you just write some basic points. Now a lot of students end up getting 3 or 5 marks because they think that they have written well because they write some points and according to them they have done their best. But you haven't impressed the examiner, right? And there's no development of the argument. It's quite one-sided. And although there is still they are saying that there is relevant use of economic concepts, terminology, information, and data appropriate to the question. So they are saying that you are providing the relevant information, but again, you have not made a reasonable argument, right? So you will end up only getting 3 answers. So you see the amount of expectation the examiner has and the clear-cut instructions he has provided to the student, right? And level 1 answer would be where you will able to score 1 or 2, where you just write simple economic definition and terminology, and a few references may be made to economic theory with occasional level of understanding. Like it's not quite clear, it's somehow clear, but not really clear. So in that case, you will only get up ending 1 or 2 marks. So again, a few reasons why cars should be produced by the private sector. Obviously, we have more or less covered everything. It is more competitive. Obviously, since there's a lot of competition in the private sector, because in the private sector, there won't be any barrier to entry and exit. Remember, we studied that in a private sector market, there is no barrier to entry or exit. Anyone can come and start competing, right? So that would result into lower prices because of competition. Secondly, there's profit incentives. So obviously, it raises efficiency, and it also encourages the firms to, produce what consumers want and keep the cost low. So there would be productive efficiency. You would call it there would be productive efficiency. Productive efficiency, because what is productive efficiency? Productive efficiency means keeping average cost low. So obviously, why would firms want to keep average cost low? Because there's a lot of competition. So they would want to keep their cost low because it would help make their cars competitive amongst others, right? Again, since it's a private sector, so obviously there's more higher investment taking place in the private sector because private sector wants to expand, and when private sector expands, there's more investment taking place, and obviously more investment means you scale up your business. And when you scale up your business, basically it improves quality and it lowers the cost, and then you can also sell shares and take a bank loan, etc., right? And Plus, there's one more point that the examiner has made, which is a relevant point, but okay, fine. If you don't even write it, then that's not a problem. It says that they may be forced to be efficient as may not be supported by the government. Now, what they are saying is that since private sector will be producing the cars only, and the government will not be, producing these cars, there's a possibility that the government would not end up supporting. So, if there is no chance, no possibility of government support, how can the government support? They can end up providing subsidies to inefficient car firms, right? So those firms who are very inefficient, they have a high cost. The government might provide subsidies to them. So the possibility that there might be no support, this possibility might result into fear, and then because of this fear, then they become efficient, right? So this is another point, which is not a wrong point. You can write it as well, but again, this is the whole reason behind that point. But again, that's so. If you are saying that private production has certain advantages, then public production also has certain advantages. So first of all, there's a big possibility that in the private sector, monopolies might take place and they might exploit consumer. That is a disadvantage of the private sector. That possibility of monopoly exploitation exists. But you know, in a public sector, this monopolies might not exist, or even if there is a monopoly, we know that public monopolies, if there are any public monopolies, then public monopolies don't exploit. So not all monopolies are bad, especially if they're public monopolies, they're not bad, right? So public monopolies don't exploit, and public sector will keep low prices, cheap cars for the poor, like I mentioned before as well. There's another thing that is mentioned, that public sector firms may take into account the external cost and benefits and welfare. So you can talk about the fact that the external cost of production might be taken into consideration. There might be a possibility that the public sector cars might be more green in terms of releasing less uh, carbon emissions as compared to private sector cars. And again, the fact that you are saying over here that there the this point that you're saying, just a second, this point that you're saying that there is more higher investment taking place in the private sector is not necessary, because the state may also have more financial resources and may be able to invest on a larger scale. So this is evaluation. Or previously you were saying that the private sector has more money to invest because private sector investment has huge sums of money, but in every country it differs. So in one country, the public sector, I'll tell you something very carefully. Now listen to this very carefully. In a country like Pakistan, in a country like Dubai and Saudi, right, the kingdom, right, they have more money. The state has more money than your private firms. But in Pakistan, the private firms and private entrepreneurs have more money than the state. So again, it differs from country to country. So if you are saying that the private sector has more money to invest and scale up the business, then it's not always the case. Because if you are in a country where, if you're producing cars in a country where the public sector, the state has more money, maybe the state has huge reserves of natural resources such as oil that it exports to all parts of the world, in that, such as the kingdom, such as Saudi, right, such as the UAE. So they obviously have the money. They are a superpower in terms of oil production and extraction and supply. Global monopoly in the top among the top countries extracting and supplying oil, and they generate huge revenues on that. So obviously they will have more financial resources. So it's not, again, this is what evaluation is. You are steering your answer in bringing the examiner's attention to a certain point that you are saying. On one side you are saying that car production should be by the private sector because private sector has huge sums of money which they can invest, and they can invest that money in research and development. They can invest that money in because देखो होगा क्या. For example, let's take the example of Bright. So Bright is raising an investment. So who will invest in Bright? Private entrepreneurs, right? Private entrepreneurs will invest in Bright. The government of Pakistan will not invest in Bright. So if Bright was a was a company that was run by the state of or the government of Pakistan, the private sector entrepreneurs would have not maybe not invested in Bright, because the objective would have been to not make profit. Obviously, it was run by the state. But if the company is run by the private sector, then definitely other private entrepreneurs would be willing to invest. Other private firms would be willing to invest. And yes, it is a fact that private sector firms do have huge sums of money which they are willing to lend out because they are making huge profits. They are willing to invest in other companies and scale up other businesses. And then, so there's more private sector expansion. Private sector expansion does result into more economic growth. But the fact that in some states, the public sector may have, or the state may have, huge reserves of financial capital available, and they might be willing to invest as well. So that cannot be ignored. So, तुम examiner को you are steering that argument by saying that you can't ignore this point. How can you just comment on the fact that private sector only has the money? Again, steering your answer to bringing the examiner's attention to a certain point is what evaluation, and that what makes the examiner very happy. He's like, oh, you know what? Just look at the student. He knows so much. He's thinking, for that, economics being a subject, because economics is a very subject that has to be studied in depth, because economics is a critical thinking subject. You need to think deep and critically, right? And that is a skill that you must develop if you want to get good grades. Otherwise, if you just want to rote learn from the book, you will only end up getting maybe a B. Or if the question comes in your favor, then maybe an A as well. But you will then not be able to get the best out of yourself in A levels, because A level economics is more and more evaluation based. So again, for an answer like this is how you will write an answer. But again, O levels may the examiners do not expect you to write last. There's no conclusion that is required. The examiners are not expecting you to write a conclusion in the end. That is not expected. For example, I do not expect my students to ask me, how are you doing, sir? How was your day? I do not expect it. Which means if they do not ask me, I will not be bad to them. I won't have any grudges for them. Because I do not expect it. Why would I have penalized them for something I don't expect? But if they ask me, will it make me feel good about it? Obviously, I'm a human being. It will. If someone asks me, how was your day? I'll be like, oh, life, thank you for asking. I will consider that person as a good person, right? So again, if you write a conclusion in the exam, it won't make any harm to your answer. In fact, it will have a good impression on the exam. Although it is not required, something that is not required does not mean it does not have to be done at all. If you want to write a conclusion, to the end of your answer, then why you are champion of the subject, you know how to write your answer, then fine, go write a conclusion. So I always have an argument with a lot of kids whom teachers, tell them that conclusion is not required. So yeah, I know it's not required. And I'm not insisting you to write one. But if you write one, if you know how to write one, and if you write one, your answer will clearly stand out from others. That is not what I'm saying. So now this is how you. So maybe I would end up writing a conclusion like this, right? If I have time for the exam, I would end up concluding my answer by saying that hence public and private sector car production has its own advantages and disadvantages, and in some countries or in some situations, car production done by the state only, that is the public sector only, इसको बोलते हैं reasoned conclusion. क्या बोलते हैं? Reasoned conclusion, जो ऊपर आपके पास लिखा हुआ भी था L3 आंसर में. अब आप लोग हो सकता है ये देख रहे हो कि यार ये तो मेरे आंसर्स तो माय आंसर्स आर जस्ट रिडिकुलस एंड दे आर नॉट इवन क्लोज टू दिस. So I'm not even expecting you to write close to this. You have 6 months. You have to improve on it, right? In that case, is the topmost priority. Then in that case, public sector production might seem a suitable option. ठीक है जी. So hence public and private sector. अब बहुत गौर से सुनिएगा. There are three very important things that I want you to focus on. First of all, it says I'm concluding my now. This is not expected in the exam. If you don't write it, it won't make a difference to your answer. If your above answer is like आपने पीछे सब like if you have written the best answer, so and if you don't write a conclusion, no problem, you'll get the full marks. If your answer is great, but if your answer is like average, you're not writing the best answer, and still you want to say no, I'm not going to end up writing. So in A levels, you have to write a conclusion. In O levels, you are not expected to write a conclusion. So I think अब तुम intuitively सोचो ना मैं क्या कहना चाह रहा हूँ. So I think you got the hint what I'm trying to say. So hence public and private sector car production has its own advantages in some countries or in some situations. Now listen to this very carefully. Car production done by the state only. If the country situation is like that it's a poor country, so car production done by the private sector might help, right? It might be. I'm not saying will be. I've written might be beneficial. I'm not telling the examiner that this will be applicable. What I'm writing will be applicable in every situation. The use of words is very careful. Sir, are we supposed to think on such micro level? Do we have to take into consideration of the words? And yes, you have to, because the moment you write public will, it means that this is a fact. Okay? So I'm writing it might be beneficial, but the fact that quality would not be as great as the private sector cars, and economically as well, private sector production is more contributing factor to GDP if done on grand scale. Sorry, मैंने complete ही नहीं की line. Just a second. Cannot be ignored. That okay, fine. I agree that it's really beneficial for the poor countries and for the poor people, because everyone wants to travel in car, right? So it will help people get good quality. I mean, decent quality cars at a cheaper price. So yes, in that sense, but the fact that quality, don't say quality would be poor. Poor quality means that it's something, it's not, I mean, just say that it's not as good as claiming don't always blame the public sector for everything. This is a very important thing. At times you can write poor quality, but not always. भाई क्या हर वक्त क्या state गंदे poor quality material use होगा क्या? Not always, right? At times, yes, the state does not have tax revenues. It might end up making poor quality stuff, but not always. That is not a narrative. That is not a cliche that you will use in every time when you are blaming. Don't write it that you are blaming the public sector for everything, for producing poor quality stuff all the time. That's a big claim that you are making if you say that. So the fact that quality would not be as great as the private sector cars, and economically as well, private sector production is more contributing factor to GDP. Now, here what I've written is very carefully. So, what I'm saying is that private sector companies are big companies. They are providing significant tax revenues to the government. What about that? What about those tax revenues? What about that contribution to GDP that they are making, right? That won't take place. What's the main objective right now? If the main objective is living standards and income inequality, then leave that. If that is the main objective, if that is the topmost priority, then in that case, public sector production might seem a suitable option. Again, might seem a suitable option. You are suggesting, you are not claiming that this is the only option. Okay, so this is it for today's class. If there's any questions, I'll see you all in the next class.